Hello, my name is David Ralph. This is my contribution to the One Team Gov call for ideas about future leadership in the 21st century. I'm just going to share a few ideas in particular about collaboration, which is very pleased to see you kind of cite as one of the key components of this kind of 21st century leadership challenge, along with co-design and collective leadership. But I'm going to focus on collaboration because I think that's really where my expertise and experience has been focused, principally in areas like the public sector in the UK and the NHS, but also in a previous career in the military. So I've got a mixed background. I did a degree in economics. I spent 15 years in the military, did a range of kind of policy and operational stuff, then worked in the environmental sector, helping the UK government develop energy policy. And then I started working in the NHS as the head of strategy and business planning at a big hospital in Bristol. And then latterly, I was the director of Bristol Health Partners, organising a kind of coalition of organisations across the city with a focus on supporting population health and dealing with health inequalities. And as part of that job, I also helped set up the city office in Bristol and the early stages of what has become One City approach and the One City plan. So my career has really been all about collaboration, and what I try and do now is kind of share what I think are some of the ways in which you can approach collaboration in a way that makes it more likely to be successful in practice. And I guess the thing which I really want to share is a couple of things that I found helpful in terms of, if you like, kind of conceptual frameworks around collaboration and how you approach it, which certainly have helped me in my career and have been based on the sort of my experience and learning in all those different settings. So the first one is about how you think about systems. There's a lot of discussion at the moment about systems leadership, about place leadership, and about what that really means in practice, and a desire to try and help people become system or place leaders as opposed to just organisational ones, which is something I'm particularly interested in. The first piece of learning that I wanted to share is about the way in which you kind of conceptualise your role and your place in a system and what you mean when you use that word, system. So for me, a helpful way to think about it has been a system as a sort of collection of relationships and decisions that produces outcomes. So having a very clear focus on how the system creates the outcomes that are part of our everyday life, and describing the system in terms of those outcomes and how they are created or kind of accepted is, I think, a really interesting and important place to start. So for example, we currently have a health system, if you define it very broadly in the UK, which creates some really horrific inequalities. So to some extent we're all participating in a system that creates a 10-year gap in life expectancy. And that's everybody, members of the public, but also crucially members of the NHS and the senior kind of management of organisations like that. And so asking people to reflect on how they are part of and active within a system rather than just kind of subjects of it, I think is really important. So a sort of a very positive version of that is to say to people, whatever place in the system that you have, you'll have some agency, you'll have some ability to have some impact. And you should try and see yourself as an active participant in a system and not just a subject of it. I think it's extremely pervasive that systems are externalized in some way. So you'll hear a lot of people say, this system needs to do that, the system needs to do this. But actually what they really mean is people within the system, like me, need to do things differently. And challenging people to see their role in a much more active way, so to become, if you like, activists and participants rather than just commentators, I think is really important. A slightly more challenging way to phrase that would be to say we're all colluding in a system that creates these horrific outcomes. Another good example would be we are all collectively colluding in a system that allows poor air quality to kill 40,000 people a year in the UK. And presented like that, it's a much more kind of challenging way to ask individuals to reflect on their own connection to a system and the way in which they can begin to have agency within it. Because if people don't see themselves as active participants in a system, then I think they will find it very difficult to engage with the broader challenge of kind of system and place leadership. People aren't subjects, they're participants. That's a crucial first distinction. Secondly, I think it's important to think in maybe more nuanced ways than we do about what we mean by collaboration. So for example, when I was working in Bristol, it became very clear that the motives for collaborating, both at an individual and organisational level, can vary substantially. They can literally be at one end, from an NHS chief executive essentially saying, I'm collaborating because my boss, Simon Stevens, the chief executive of NHS, has told me that I must, or it's kind of the brand new thing, and I think it'll help me move on in my career and sort of stake a claim to be a sort of innovative person, right through to the other end of the scale, which is people who are very clearly motivated by kind of societal outcomes, who have a much more emotional attachment to working with others, and for whom structures and organisations are actually much less important, and longer term social outcomes and delivering those with others is really key. In between, you'll have different versions of that. So for example, an organisational person who's collaborating because they will be able to work with others to achieve something that's important to them. Again, the health system is full of good examples of that. Through to people who are just trying more generally to develop collaborative capability because they think that's the way that we help to solve problems or issues in places like cities. But the key, I think, and this is my sort of second big point, is that there is a range of different ways to conceptualize collaboration, from a very personal organizational motive to one which is much more kind of societally focused. And understanding where people are with regard to that sort of continuum, I think, is really important in terms of creating collaborations that will work in practice. And then the third thing which I wanted to talk about was the way in which I guess I've come across sort of three layers of kind of leadership or change within the systems that I've worked with in places like Bristol. And it's to kind of challenge people to reflect specifically on those and the way in which interacting with those layers shapes their own leadership. So I think there are basically kind of three. This isn't particularly original. Other people have talked about this, but there is a structural layer to leadership, there is a conceptual layer to it, and there is an emotional layer to it. So in a place like Bristol, which is probably where I'm most familiar with, then in and around the city there'll be lots of different structures that give shape to the way in which we work together. They will be organisations, of course, but they will also be things like plans and things like business cases. There'll be things like the Gantt charts on the wall and the sort of governance around the way in which kind of council meetings will work. And I think that the mistake that we often make is to assume that good structures will themselves deliver good outcomes, or the right structure will deliver the change that you need. And demonstrably that isn't the case. I think it's much more helpful to think about structures as frameworks that enable collaboration, kind of things that stake out areas of general kind of cooperation and the sort of field in which we're all trying to operate, rather than things which specifically control the way in which we work. Because if you rely too much on structures to deliver the outcomes that you seek, then A, that won't happen, but B, you will end up becoming trapped by those structures. And so to some extent, the issues which you end up trying to tackle together will look like the structures that you are a part of. And if that happens, then that's very reductive, and it is not a way to innovate or to create better things across, for example, a city. And then the other end is the emotional component of leadership, which is the way in which people do or don't connect with the notion that they themselves are a leader in a place or rather than an organisation. So the extent to which, for example, the chief executive of a big NHS trust engages in wider collaborative leadership in a place will be as much of an emotional kind of construct as it is a sort of structural or a sort of job spec one. So what I mean by that is that you have to understand and connect to the emotional component of leadership and motivation. It's a rather sort of obvious statement, but I think it's often overlooked in the way in which we think about leadership and engagement with leaders. And then in between is the sort of, in many ways, the most interesting layer, which is the conceptual layer. And what I mean by that is the way in which the internalized kind of theories of things like value or the cognitive frameworks that we use to think about and make decisions are kind of manifested in practice, and being really, really aware of how our own behavior is shaped by those different conceptual structures. So what I mean by that is that if you don't start to interrogate the conceptual side of things, then you probably won't ask yourself questions like why is it that, because despite the fact that in the health system we've talked till we're blue in the face about prevention and doing more to promote and support health rather than treat illness, we still spend money in very similar ways. So we still spend the vast amount of our money on acute delivery of healthcare as opposed to wider public health or promoting kind of wellness or well-being in a more sort of general sense. And the answer is that there's a conceptual framework somewhere in our decision making that says that one thing is more important than another. And we might never state it in those terms, but what I'm interested in is the way in which these things are manifested in practice. So there is a theory of value in healthcare spending which says acute spending is where it's at, and public health spending is not where we should be focusing our effort, which is bizarre because most evidence tells you that actually in terms of wider societal outcomes, then the opposite is true. But there is something embedded in our conceptual frameworks and the decision making that sits on top of those in practice that is preventing us from doing things differently. And unless we shine a light on that, we will never change. Other more sort of prosaic examples are things like, what does the business case template look like within an organization? Because for most big organizations, that's the kind of single point at which all major investments decisions must flow. And there'll be a conceptual framework, embedded in that, on page 2 where it has a list of criteria, and it says, apply these different criteria, spending it, maybe, and it might have number 1, savings in the next 2 years. It might have number 10, wider societal benefit, and those will be weighted. And I guarantee you that the savings in the next 2 years will be weighted far, far more heavily than the savings over a 10-year period or the wider public health impacts. And the truth of it is that is a demonstration in practice, right on the page, of what we collectively regard as important, or at least our decision-making frameworks tell us that we regard as important. And interrogating that conceptual framework, I think, is essential, because unless you as a leader start to pick apart your own conceptual frameworks and the way you make decisions and what they say about how you think about value and what's important, then again, it's very difficult to change. So I haven't tried to be sort of, comprehensive in any sense in this submission, but I really wanted to focus on collaboration as I think the sort of key components of 21st century leadership, and to share in practice kind of 3 big things which I think are important at the outset in terms of approaching collaboration in a way which is more likely to be successful. And to recap, those things are, try yourself and to help others think of themselves as active participants in systems, as opposed to subjects of them. You can't externalize that. You have to engage, and you have to be considering yourself part of a system that creates outcomes which you to some degree are responsible for. Secondly, be nuanced and, if you can, specific about the way in which you use the term collaboration, and realize that there are very different motivations for collaboration at individual and organizational level, and 10 people sat around the table will be in very different places often, and you have to start with a nice open discussion, which also, by the way, helps to build trust about where people are in terms of the way in which they understand collaboration and the motives for it. And then thirdly, try where you can to think about the challenge of leadership in these kind of 3 ways. The structural layer, which is important, it's necessary but not sufficient. The structures themselves will never deliver the outcomes that you seek. And if you get this wrong, they will also trap you in old ways of working. Secondly, acknowledge and respect the emotional components of leadership. Tap into that yourself and be open and honest with others about it, and try and have discussions with other fellow travellers about what the emotional side of their kind of leadership journey looks like. And then the third of those layers, which I think is probably the most important, is the conceptual layer, the invisible hidden layer, which kind of traps us in ways of doing things and is hidden within all of the ways in which we make decisions and, importantly, allocate our resources. So unless you're thinking about the structural, the emotional and the conceptual layer together, and you're challenging yourself about your own relationships with those different layers and your preconceptions around things like what is important, then I would argue that a new type of leadership is very difficult. Thank you for listening if you got this far. I would really love to contribute more to what I think is going to be a great programme. If you would like to get in touch with me in any case to discuss any more of this, please do. My email address is dcjrelf@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.